like magic, we are now live. It is all you guys.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. If you're joining us on Zoom or if you're joining us on Facebook, we have some really fun content today that we're going to be talking about. So today we're going to be talking about seed to sale software. And if you're familiar with cannabis, that's the inventory management piece. And a little bit of background about myself and my co-host today, Brian York. My name is Melissa Diaz, and I am a CPA. I have focused on the cannabis industry for the last 7 years. What my firm at Rebel Rock does is we outsource the accounting solutions specifically to cannabis. So we vet everything from processes, systems, technology. We'll implement really unique and special technology for our clients. And then we also help the technology that they have work better together. So we are a little bit more unique than, your normal CPA firm. Additionally, one of the things we're talking about today is my needs as an accountant are oftentimes different than my co-host needs. And I'll let him introduce himself and give a little bit of his background.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melissa. And welcome everybody. Like Melissa said, we have some really interesting content to cover today, talking seed to sale software. As she mentioned, a lot of differences, but some really big correlations between the needs of an operator's perspective in the cannabis business versus her as an accountant perspective. So I'm excited to kind of share what that looks like. A little background on myself. I've been in legal commercial cannabis for about a decade now, heavily focused in both indoor and greenhouse production, plant growth, manufacturing, distribution, infusion, and extraction. So I'm excited to share the perspective from the operator, and hopefully Melissa can share the accounting.
Yeah. So let's just go over a little bit of terminology to start with, just so everyone's on the same page with some of the words we'll use. So as I mentioned, when we talk seed to sale software, we're really referring to inventory management. And it's important to understand that this is different than what a lot of you may know as Metric. Metric is a state reporting system, and it's a compliance system. It is not intended to help operators actually track the movement of cannabis product through its supply chain. It's also not intended to help us as accountants assess a cost associated with those movements. So important distinction there. Seed to sale, different than Metric. The reason we use seed to sale as the term is because generally you have to track a product from the moment it enters your door until you actually sell it, whether that's wholesale or retail. And so it may not actually be seed to sale for you. You may be getting a, partially converted product, like maybe you're taking distillate, using that, putting it into an edible, and then selling an edible. So you don't per se have a seed to sale, but we mean the same thing. It's the inventory management software. When we use the term MSO, we're talking about a multi-state operator. So groups that are in more than one state, which is where that inventory management system gets even more important, because we want to make sure that the states keep staying compliant with the individual requirements in that state for the cannabis program. But also we want to make sure that those systems are being used intelligently, so we're not losing sight of any of, maybe our locations where we're not physically there. Compliance, of course, there's a lot of compliance in cannabis. It is a heavily controlled substance. And so we need to do a whole lot of reporting. Actually, Brian tends to need to do a whole lot of reporting, more than I do, on the compliance side, to make sure that we're staying, we're keeping all the proper records, that we're making sure that we know what happened to our product, nothing goes missing. And of course, that we're reporting that back to the state so that we don't lose our license, most importantly. And then, of course, when we talk about the various different supply chain verticals today, we're going to be talking about cultivation, which is the growing of plants. So that's actually growing flower. You may use that flower to then convert into something else. So that's what we call processing and manufacturing. So this is where you take that flower, maybe you create a distillate, maybe you create an oil, rosin, resin, full spectrum, gummies, edibles, any kind of conversion of that you can think of other than just straight flower. And then retail is what we talk about at the dispensary level. So those are really the main verticals we're going to be discussing today. And by the way, if you guys have questions, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat on Zoom, or you can ask questions on Facebook. So, oops, it's not, there we go. All right. So Brian, why don't you start off with kind of your perspective on what you need to know as an operator and why the seed to sale system is important, why some are better than others. We'll get to the actual recommendations later, but just kind of explaining what's been your experience in the industry using different systems. Oh, got technical difficulties. I will go ahead and talk about my perspective then. So while we're waiting for Brian to get back connected to audio, one of the biggest things that a lot of people don't understand when they're on the production side of cannabis is that we need to be tracking cost as accountants well before the plant is actually produced. So your production cycle, right? It might be 3 or 4 months where you're growing the plant, harvesting it, drying it, trimming it. We need to be able to assess the cost that you incurred 3 months ago to a product we're selling today, right? So that's actually more difficult than a lot of people think. Most people think, oh, money in, money out. We know how much money we made this month. Doesn't work that way. We need to figure out what the actual profitability is associated with each strain that you're growing, associated with each product that you're producing. And each of those has a different timeline and different set of metrics that we track in order to assess a cost with it. So Brian, are you back on audio now? No, we can't hear you.
Oh, there we
go. Okay, we got
that,
you.
everybody. I had some tech difficulties going on. You got me now? Sorry about
Yep.
that, everybody. I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me. Yeah, so great job, Melissa, talking about that, the difference for accountant versus us. And just to plug in a little info there, we're tracking every aspect from the operator perspective, what plant I'm putting in, where it's in my cycle, and trying to pull out those data metrics that are extremely valuable to us as operations perspective for, harvest forecasting, things like that, but they're going to plug directly into the accounting side for Melissa as well. They're going to create cash flow, projection, forecasting, things like that. So they go hand in hand.
They do. And what's interesting is one of the big pieces that's important for both of us to know is yield, right? So this is information that oftentimes we can get out of a seed to sale. Which strains produce the most product, right? And of that product, what was the highest quality? So as many of us in the industry know, THC percentage is not necessarily the mark of a good product, but we ended up charging more for a product with higher THC. That's just how it works in the industry. And so knowing which strains, which type of plants, what conditions they were under that created that yield, a lot of that information is able to be garnered from the seed to sale system. That's going to be important.
And particularly, sorry, Melissa.
Nope, go ahead. I was going to pass back to you anyway.
No, I was going to say, when you start talking about those a little more robust features, if we were to compare, say, metric, which is going to be state compliance tracking, metric is not going to be concerned with how much performance am I getting out of a plant per se. It is going to be concerned with how much yield or how much is going into a specific package, but it's not going to give me those key KPIs related to the actual cultivation of a specific strain. That is very, very valuable in selection of what we're going to grow and ultimately what's going to lead to profitability or loss on the accounting side. So great point to mention that when you talk metric versus an actual robust seed to sale software, those are things you want to start looking at from both operator and accounting finance perspective.
And one of the nuances it's important to think about with seed to sale software is if there's integrations that exist. So one of the other things a lot of times producers don't necessarily appreciate on the accounting side is how much time it takes us to get that information that's in the seed to sale over to an accounting system. So in most cases, those two systems don't talk. There's just not a lot of integrations that exist that allow those systems to natively integrate. And so that means on the accounting side, we are manually taking the information in that system and moving it over so that we can get the information we need. That can be a really time-consuming process. And in fact, the information that we're gathering is important to Brian as the producer, right? If we know that certain strains are not performing as well as others, I probably should let him know that sooner than later, so he can adjust his production side as well.
Yeah, to Melissa's point there, when you start talking about the data export functionality of these seed to sale softwares, getting a system that is able to organize and be very customizable to the reports you're trying to generate to get you to the data points you want versus really raw, exorbitant sized Excel files that is just a bunch of data on a sheet that then someone has to spend considerable time organizing to actually dig through and find what's valuable. A lot of these platforms today have done a great job allowing you to have very intelligent reporting functionality that you can select, just the data you want very quickly through a cog wheel, select, I want plant count, harvest data, expected yield, boom, in this date range. Very, very user friendly in a lot of platforms versus some of these older platforms, pure raw data, very hard to work with. So something to keep in mind as you make these selections for what software you want to use.
And one of the things about that, to the robustness of the reporting and the user interface, sometimes you're going to have people interfacing with these systems that are not necessarily super tech savvy, right? The person that's trimming that maybe needs to get some information into that platform may not have as much business expertise or accounting expertise or even production expertise as maybe, the director of production or director of cultivation. But the director of cultivation isn't going to be down in the details trimming, so they know what information goes into the system. So you always want to keep in mind, a system might seem really great, but if the user interface is crappy, you might have all sorts of issues because it's hard for your team to use.
Yeah, and to that point, Melissa, when you start thinking about how many people generally need to touch the platform throughout the business function, having a robust level of user capabilities is very, very important. As you said, a director of cultivation is going to have access to every aspect of that software and capable of touching every piece. But a trimmer per se, you don't want them having any kind of ability to come in and wipe out an inventory room or change plant IDs, things like that. And systems of the past or some of these more entry level programs don't have those robust features built in that really safeguard, this key crucial compliant data that you have to rely on its accuracy.
And since we're talking about data accuracy and robustness of that data, I think that's a really good time to get into compliance and financial reporting. So I failed to mention on our little definitions page, this other little thing that's really important to us accountants called 280E. If you're not familiar with it, it's a really punitive area of tax code that eliminates substantially all business deductions for cannabis operators. So the only thing I can deduct as a cannabis operator is my direct cost of sales. So that's like your fertigation supplies, your, the actual cost, the labor that was required to grow the plant, the labor that was required to trim the plant. But if I'm at the dispensary level, the bud tender who's selling that plant, that's considered a sales activity. I don't get to deduct that expense. So being able to properly track these costs is not just from the compliance perspective as we think of state reporting, but it's also for compliance for IRS. We have to make sure that we're clearly delineating which of our expenses are actually deductible, and then being able to support that in the event that we get audited by the IRS. Now, Brian has a very different level of compliance requirement that he needs these systems for.
Correct. And yeah, when we start talking from the operator perspective, compliance is going to be related to your state laws, legal compliance regarding cannabis cultivation, manufacturing, and sales. And they're clearly defined state by state. A lot of overlap state to state, but there's specific nuance to every state that's a little bit different as you operate. But equal punishment for not being compliant in every state. You're talking about fines being levied, potential revocation of license, which puts your entire business in jeopardy. So making sure these systems check those boxes of, at any given time, I can pull up a complete serialized list of individual barcodes per plant. I can tell you what plant or what, clone came off what mother in what room at what time by whom. These are extremely important metrics when you talk compliance at the operator level. Same thing when you get into the actual manufacturing and you start converting product from, hey, I trimmed this flower down and now it's going to make an eighth, or I'm going to extract this product into distillate, like Melissa said. You have to track every step of that and say 1,000 grams of X became, 250 half ounces or whatever it may be. And you need to be able to provide that information generally outside of an Excel spreadsheet when the state comes knocking on the door to do their inspections. So compliance is massive component to selecting this proper software within each state.
And one other thing I want to mention that sometimes operators don't fully understand is looking back at our IRS type of compliance that we need to be aware of. The IRS is really black and white. on many of these issues. They don't give a lot of understanding. They don't give a lot of wiggle room. And basically, if you can't support your numbers in the eyes of the IRS, it didn't happen. So one of the other things that's really important about these systems that sometimes gets overlooked is the necessity and importance of the historical reporting that exists. So little anecdote here. There's a system many of you may have heard of called MJ Freeway. It was a very early mover in the seed to sale space. They gained a lot of market share early on, had a whole lot of issues, as growing companies do, we'll overlook them for their issues now. But one of the biggest problems that we ran into as accountants when we were first getting into this industry, first learning about these systems, is that MJ Freeway did not provide any historical reporting. So if you didn't save the reports that came out of that system that day, we could not go back later and pull them. That's really not great when you're trying to do a historical reconciliation and no one ever pulled the historical reports or retained them. You just lost all of that data. And so that's one of those things that understanding the nuances of this system and understanding that, again, Brian has slightly different needs than we do. Maybe he got the information he needed from the movements, but he doesn't need to retain that historical information necessarily as robustly as we do. That's a really big consideration and can absolutely come back to kind of, bite you in the ass later.
Absolutely correct, Melissa. And I can speak to the situation of MJ Freeway you're speaking of the data loss. I operated on the Gen 1 MJ Freeway platform, and we experienced this lack of historical reporting. We were, fortunately at the time, a buttoned up group that was really good about saving our data and things like that. But I can't stress enough the importance of the historical data that's being captured on a daily basis. Every business I've been a part of or worked with or consulted for, we've looked back at this prior data. It builds everything. When it comes time to, are you going to sell your business? Are you going to take on, capital investment? All of these questions come up instantly. And, I'm going to overlap to Melissa's accounting side at this, but that's the first question they show up with is, show me your data. Do you have your data? And then generally the answer is no. And a ton of time is then spent to actually compile this data package that, assuming you've selected the correct software out of the gate, you could click a few buttons and have a really nice package immediately available to you. So something to consider.
And one of the other considerations that comes in with this is, compliance and financial reporting does have a lot to do with what we're talking about, right? Legal, IRS, all those requirements. But what about when you want to sell your company? Right? So now I want to sell my company. I need to get all this information together. My information around how much I'm growing, what my yield is, what my inventory turns have been, have I had to destroy any product? All of that information is wildly important when we're talking M&A. And so the more data you have generally, and the more data you have easily at your fingertips, it's going to make that due diligence process easier, probably going to yield you a higher valuation because you seem like you got your shit together. And ultimately, you'll get your beautiful exit. On the flip side, I've seen more deals just fall apart because groups could not get that data together, or they did maybe, but it just didn't make sense, right? So the ease of that reporting can also really become important when you're in a due diligence situation.
Yeah, and to that point, Melissa, this will kind of answer a question that Christy posted in the chat about audit trails. I agree. I've seen the same scenario you just described. And hey, we were able to produce, documents in front of you that have lots of numbers, but we have no real way to validate them or, put some confidence behind them. And this is where these more robust software programs have really nice audit trail features built in. Every person has unique IDs as they navigate the system. It's leaving cookie trails behind anytime adjustments or actions are taken, creating a plant, destroying a plant, converting product to another product. Their name, the timestamp, the date, everything kind of stamps in a historical record that you can come back through and actually, say I wanted to report for the month and look at what were the adjustments made in inventory. And it would show me every inventory adjustment, site by site, location by location, or categorically. And that allows you to kind of say some validation to the point of, I just showed you, we produce 10,000 pounds a year. Here's the historical harvest data to go with that versus just, well, no, take my word, 10,000 pounds is what we do. So
absolutely. So let's get into actually some recommendations on software here. Whoops. Oh no, I didn't skip a thing. Sorry, I thought I skipped a slide. Brian, you want to talk a little bit about some of the seed to sales? We have Dutchie up here. If you guys aren't familiar, Dutchie is Leaf Logics. Dutchie purchased Leaf Logics. Do you want to talk about that one a little bit, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw out there, I have no endorsement for Leaf or Dutchie. They're not paying me to do anything, but I'm an absolute proponent for this platform. I was one of the earlier users of it as I migrated from the MJ platform. And they really listen from an operator's perspective, and it's highly customizable. It's extremely user friendly from an interface perspective. Like Melissa mentioned, you can have a trimmer using it and putting in data all the way up to the highest level, and your CFO can play around and get the data they need out of it. It tracks virtually everything. And one of my biggest features I really love about it, if you're a larger business, Melissa mentioned MSOs, things like that, you can, from a module perspective is what they call it, you can actually drop down and toggle between your locations, say within a state. And it really helps streamline some efficiencies where if you're jumping, even if it's the same platform, jumping between site to site, you might have duplications of purchase order versus a trip plan, whereas I can internally send this kind of documentation and it instantly populates. So a lot of really nice efficiency features that some of these other platforms just don't offer. So
yep.
I'm
also not sponsored by Dutchie. They're not paying me for this. I have to agree. It is my favorite seed to sales system out there. It's really user-friendly, as Brian mentioned. From our perspective, the accountant's perspective, there's a ton of really robust reporting. And we can even manipulate those reports as we need to as well. So we can even create our own custom reporting. So maybe what we need is a little different than production, but we can have our own special reports that are saved to us that we can pull as we need to for the information we need. I also really like if you're vertically integrated. So if you're doing cultivation, processing, and retail, or some combination of those three, the ability to transfer for the product. Like, let's say you have a finished product now, I want to transfer it over to my retail. That's a really easy process within this system. I'll also mention too, I used to not love their POS system so much, but they've really come up. They've made a lot of improvements on that. So if you are on the retail side, Dutchie offers a POS module as well, which is important to know. Not all of the seed to sales do. We did get a question here real quick. And I'm going to get to this question just in just a second, but it's a great question, which we'll go through some of these others. It is, what are our thoughts on QBO for earlier stage companies, and does it integrate with Dutchie? I'll get to that in just a minute. Let's talk through these other other three really quick, Brian. So next,
I was going to throw one piece on Dutchie for you real fast, Melissa, that we kind of skipped over. When we talked about metric and some of those state mandated compliance aspects, you have in Colorado or say New York, something like that. Dutchie has integrations to those state level compliance. So you still meet kind of the metric requirement or the BioTrack requirement, but you can layer that beneath your very user-friendly platform. So another plug of why I think it's probably my favorite platform available.
Yeah. I'll also mention too, by comparison to the next one we're gonna mention, which is NextTech, Dutchie's much more affordable. So NextTech, I think, is one of the greatest systems that's out there for seed to sale. They're actually really an ERP system. So they're intended to manage basically all of the verticals within a business. So it can help with HR function. It can help with CRM. It can help with, your inventory modules and your finance modules. It's really customizable, not quite as user-friendly just because it's a bit more complex. But that said, it's also really expensive. So while I love the product, I think it's one of the things it does really well is an application of labor costs. Not all the systems do that as well. That one's awesome, but it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars just to implement and to maintain. So a lot of times that one's just cost prohibitive. On Cannabis 365, this is another ERP system. They're relatively new in terms of how their life cycle as a company. This one, again, intended to be an ERP. So it pulls everything together. It gives you an inventory module. It gives you a finance module. You got a CRM in there. There's all sorts of different functionalities you can do. Definitely less expensive than a NextTech. And it is a holistic solution. So one thing that's important to know is if you're using a system like Leaf Logics, Dutchie, it's not going to handle the other functions outside of inventory. So we need a GL system for accountants. We're going to have a different system. We have to have a different system then maybe for HR management, payroll, things like that. Next Tech and Cannabis 365 pull all that into one, which is, it's nice. Generally a little more expensive. And then do you want to talk a little bit about Oracle and NetSuite, Brian?
Yeah. So NetSuite by Oracle, very similar to kind of the Next Tech or the 365 Cannabis. You're talking about an enterprise level ERP that's going to have every layer of module within. Extraordinarily customizable, used by some of the largest companies, both in cannabis and outside in the world. With that comes the barrier to entry. It's going to be one of the most expensive systems you could implement, but you can customize it at any level you would want within a business. So you're really going to see something like this, in function for these big MSOs that are, multi-state. They have many sites within each state, and it allows them to roll all of that data into one platform where they can snapshot, and just see total sales across. Customizable reports that are going to show state by state within layer of location, and roll every piece that, kind of like Melissa said, Dutchie doesn't grab, the employment labor tracking or something like that. It's going to roll all of that up into one. But again, you're only going to see this in very large scale company, just from a cost prohibitive perspective. You're on mute, Melissa.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk to the question about QBO. So QBO is used very widely in this industry. I mean, like, we have groups that are much larger than we would like them to be for using this solution, and they still use QBO. There's one, which isn't necessarily prohibitive, but QBO has taken the stance that they do not support the industry. And so because of that, there is a possibility that if they discover you are a cannabis operator on their system, that they will shut you down and keep all your data. They won't give it back to you. So I've never had that issue occur with any of my clients. And oddly enough, I haven't heard of this happening in recent years. I definitely knew of it happening, a while ago. We're talking 7 years ago. But really, I don't hear about it much anymore. So to be honest, I don't know how strict QBO is being on that. They probably appreciate the additional revenue that comes in from these cannabis companies. But because of that, there's one other limitation that's going to happen. And that is, if QBO does not support the industry, they're not going to innovate for the industry. So they're not going to be doing anything on the front to help make integrations for these systems. And there was the second part of that question is there an integration with Dutchie? Yes, it's because Dutchie built it. And it does have some integration to QBO. It is limited. So what's interesting about it is it will pull over data about movements of inventory, but it won't necessarily assign the cost in the way that we need it to for accounting. So, I would say the integration's like 60% of the way there. And then we still have to do some manual work on the other side to make that information usable in what we need as accountants. Now, I think all of those things are getting better. Again, it's one of those things that's a little hard though, right? So if QBO isn't supporting the industry, then even creating these integrations, these companies are investing money in a platform that may decide that they're not going to allow these integrations to be hosted, right? So it's a toss up. If you want a near competitor to QBO, same price point, actually in some cases a little less expensive, I think more robust. There's a system called Xero, Xero. That one's totally good with cannabis, no issue. And it's the nearest competitor to QBO that exists. It actually has the market share everywhere outside of the US, and QBO just has a really strong hold on the US market.
Melissa, one thing that might be worth mentioning, you talked about, you get really good data out, but it's limited. There's always a little bit of work to be done. There's no perfect solution across the board here. With every state having different laws, with, evolving new compliance pieces every quarter within those states, and then just the general framework and how different every cannabis business that operates is, different management agreement structures or different, company umbrella layers. You're always going to need to do some pretty good manual labor. And that's where I would just encourage everybody to partner with the proper accounting firms, things like that. Find someone trustworthy that's knowledgeable in our industry. Cannabis is just so different. We move at a velocity unlike any other industry. It's constantly evolving. Find the right partners and make good choices with software and people.
Yeah, can't agree with that more. One of the other things is, once you implement these systems, they're really sticky. So taking them out and switching to something else is really painful. You have to retrain an entire team, right? You have to retrain yourself. You have to then make sure all the data integrity was carried over. It's a nightmare. So you really want to make sure you're making good decisions around this, and really thinking it through before you're just throwing the first solution in that comes your way.
Yeah, don't rush it. It's not one size fits all.
All right. Are you still there, Brian?
Yep. Sorry, I thought
Okay.
I lost you for a sec.
So with that, I just want to open it up to any more questions you guys have. We only have a few minutes left in our session today. So any questions you guys have, shoot them our way. If you didn't get a chance to answer or ask your question on this session, you can always reach us. I can be reached at melissa@rebelrock.co. You can reach out to me at any time. And I love to answer questions on this stuff. We do tons of system setups like this for our clients.
Awesome. And you guys can reach me through Brandy and Melissa through the links.
So if we don't have any questions coming in, then we'll just do a few little, last pieces here. So as we mentioned, make sure you're vetting the software, make sure that, it's the right software for you. It's going to be a big investment, both from time and cost. So you might as well make sure you're doing it correctly. And then, like Brian said, not one size fits all. We live in the 80-20 rule. If it gets us 80% of the way there, we're pretty happy. There's always probably going to be that 20% where we're doing some sort of work to get these things to really give us the information we need. And over time, it's gotten better and better and better. But this is still an emerging market. And so the solutions are still evolving as well. Christy, you had a question, which is, do you have a checklist or template for considerations in seed to sale that could be customized by an operator and also for vetting these products out? Brian, any thoughts on that?
I don't have one handy, Christy, but I could absolutely generate one and we could get it posted up, part of the link to this. It's a pretty simple checklist, to be honest. So you're obviously going to start at the base level of what is your compliance checklist based off of your state? What boxes must I check to maintain my license? Then from there, it really kind of falls in the operator's court of what are the extra bonus features that I want? Like, do I want, separate modules? So once I harvest, I can move it into manufacturing and have clear delineation there. Do I want, a BI engine that actually, generates reports for me weekly and just shoots them to my inbox, things like that. But always start with compliance and build from there. The nice thing with a lot of these platforms, they're going to have a lot of those bonus features right out of the gate because they're tied to a lot of the compliance features. So you kind of get a lot of bonus just by checking the compliance box. So we could work on a little checklist, but I would always start with compliance.
And I would say too, a lot of times it's the production side that's driving the decision on these softwares. So don't forget about your accounting team. We need information too. So, ask your CFO, ask the accounting team that's there if they have specific needs, involve them in the conversation. Everyone will be much happier at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would throw in that all of these platforms generally do robust demos. They'll pull any and all people you want, and they will spend hours, walking you through sites. They can sometimes provide sandbox sites that actually just let you go play as if you have the software. You can't mess any data up and you can do anything you want in it, which is a lot of fun to really kind of learn the feel and the flow of these systems before you make a decision.
Yeah. So with that, our QR code is there. We can get a dish. Oh, sorry.
We have one more question.
Oh, sorry. Will Dex live recording be available after? Yes. It'll be available on our YouTube channel. And then Brandy, I'll defer to you as to how we're getting slides out.
It'll be on Facebook and each participant will get an email.
Yeah, and I can answer. Rochelle posted a question with so many states entering the market. Is there one system better or more focused for embracing the compliance and needs of each state? I would probably, lean towards Dutchy on this, Rochelle. I think they have come out as the front runner across, they're integrated to almost everywhere, with the exception, you do have a couple of states that are state mandated single systems. But what they've done is allowed the integration of that mandate system to their platform. So they've done a terrific job with that. So I would definitely suggest Dutchy as the front runner across the entire US.
100% agree with that. I also feel like they have been the most responsive to user requests. So they're constantly updating their software. They're listening to what the producers want. They listen to what we want at the accounting side. And they've definitely made actual direct changes. So that's always a good thing you want in a software partner, someone that actually listens to you and responds to what your needs are.
Absolutely agree with that, Melissa.
Yeah, so with that, thanks everyone for joining us today. I know we went a little over time, so we're going to wrap it up here. Again, contact information, go ahead and use that QR code, and you can get in touch with us. And then, you know, the recording and slides will be available on Facebook, on our YouTube, and where else, Brandy?
And attendees will get an email with all the links.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome.